The grand convocation hall had been designed by architects who believed intimidation was a valid aesthetic choice. The ceiling vaulted 3 stories overhead, decorated with bioluminescent patterns that shifted in colors humans didn't have names for. Delegates from 47 species occupied chairs arranged in careful hierarchical circles, each placement communicating volumes about political standing and diplomatic weight. Dr. Elias Worth sat in the outer ring, which was diplomatic language for "your species is tolerated but not particularly important." His official title was Cultural Anthropologist to the Human Delegation, which sounded impressive until you realized it mostly meant explaining why humans did inadvisable things and apologizing for their collective existence. 3 years he'd been at this posting. 3 years of learning Ethari customs, memorizing which gestures meant respect and which were mortal insults, and trying not to embarrass Earth during formal dinners where the silverware had more cultural significance than some human religious artifacts. The Ethari loved beauty the way some species loved conquest or others loved commerce. Their architecture flowed like frozen music. Their art was studied across 100 worlds. Their people were bred, though they'd never used that crude term, for physical harmony that approached mathematical precision. Every building, every garden, every carefully arranged formal gathering was an expression of aesthetic philosophy refined over millennia. At the center of this culture of perfection sat Queen Isaveth Cornavine. She presided over the Unity Accord negotiations from a dais that managed to be elevated without seeming arrogant, positioned so that light from the bioluminescent ceiling caught her features at angles that looked accidental but absolutely weren't. 20 years she'd ruled, since the previous monarch's death in what was delicately referred to as the succession crisis, and less delicately referred to as that messy assassination situation we don't discuss at dinner parties. Elias had observed her during formal events, the way you observe dangerous weather from a safe distance. She was brilliant. Her speeches on interspecies cooperation were studied in diplomatic academies. Ruthless when necessary, 3 trade disputes had been resolved in her favor through negotiations so precise they'd become case studies. And she carried herself with authority that made veteran ambassadors rehearse conversations in mirrors before approaching her. She was also, by Ethari standards, absolutely beautiful. High cheekbones positioned at angles that suggested deliberate design, eyes that shifted between gray and violet depending on the light, hair that fell in waves so perfect they looked painted, ears that rose in elegant points, perfectly symmetrical, the genetic markers of Ethari nobility. Elias had never spoken to her directly. His role kept him in the outer circles, providing cultural context to the human delegation head, who then ignored most of his advice and wondered why negotiations went poorly. The current session involved a dispute over mining rights in a contested asteroid belt. A Thalian ambassador was making an argument that technically violated protocol by directly contradicting something Queen Isaveth had said in a previous session. Elias winced internally, waiting for the diplomatic equivalent of a car crash. The Queen let the ambassador finish. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that makes people reconsider life choices. When she spoke, her voice carried across the hall without rising in volume. "Ambassador Thelk, I appreciate your species' perspective on resource allocation. However, your statement contains an inaccuracy regarding my previous position. I made no such claim about exclusive access. What I proposed was a joint venture with profit-sharing arrangements proportional to investment. If you're going to contradict me, please have the courtesy to contradict what I actually said rather than a version you found more convenient." The Thalian ambassador made a sound like air escaping from a deflating balloon. Several delegates suddenly found their datapads fascinating. Elias watched the Queen's face, the way she maintained perfect composure while verbally dismantling an argument. Professional admiration, he told himself. You appreciate competent people regardless of species. But he caught something others seemed to miss. The brief moment when her hand rose to touch her jaw, fingers tracing something there before she caught herself and lowered her hand again. When light hit at certain angles, there was a faint line along her jawline. Barely visible, mostly hidden beneath cosmetics applied with such skill they seemed like natural skin. A scar, Elias realized. Small enough that most wouldn't notice, significant enough that she apparently tried to hide it. The session ended with the usual diplomatic formalities, careful words and careful exits in careful order. Elias gathered his notes, preparing to brief a delegation head who would ignore everything he said, when an attendant approached. "Dr. Worth, Her Majesty Queen Isaveth requests your presence for a private audience." Elias' brain took several seconds to process this information, during which his mouth apparently decided to operate independently. Did she get the right Worth? There's probably other Worths, more important Worths. Worths who didn't spill tea on themselves during the last formal dinner. The attendant's expression suggested she was reconsidering every life choice that led to this moment. Her Majesty was quite specific. Tomorrow, 3rd hour past dawn, in her private study. Attendance is requested but functionally mandatory. I'll send you the location and protocol guidelines. She left before Elias could ask any of the approximately 70 questions currently fighting for space in his brain. The human delegation head, Ambassador Pritchard, was predictably unhelpful when Elias reported the summons. "What did you do?" "Nothing. I sit in the outer circle and take notes. I'm professionally invisible." Nobody is professionally invisible to Queen Isaveth. She notices everything. Pritchard looked at him with the expression reserved for subordinates who have created problems. "Whatever she asks, be diplomatic. Don't make jokes." Humans have a terrible habit of making jokes when we're nervous, and Ithari humor doesn't translate well. So no jokes, just diplomatic answers to questions I don't know. From a queen who terrifies ambassadors with decades of experience. "Exactly. I'm so glad we understand each other." Elias spent 12 hours researching private audience protocols, which turned out to be extensive and contradictory depending on which historical period's customs you referenced. He settled on a strategy of extreme politeness, and praying to gods he didn't believe in that he wouldn't accidentally insult anyone's ancestors. The Queen's private study was nothing like he expected. No throne, no dais, no carefully arranged intimidation. Just a room lined with books, actual physical books, rare enough to be valuable across most of the galaxy. The lighting was softer than the harsh perfection of public spaces, coming from fixtures that mimicked natural daylight. Queen Isaveth sat in a chair designed for reading rather than ruling, and when Elias entered, she didn't immediately speak. The silence stretched long enough that he started mentally reviewing everything he might have done to warrant execution. Finally, she set aside the book she'd been holding. "Dr. Worth, thank you for accepting my invitation." "Your Majesty." Though I'm not sure accepting is the right word for something that was functionally mandatory. Her mouth twitched, amusement maybe. "Honest, that's rare in this court. Please sit." Elias sat in the indicated chair, which was actually comfortable, and waited. The protocol guidelines had been very clear about not speaking until addressed with a direct question. "I have a question," the Queen said. "One I've wanted to ask a human for some time, but the opportunity hasn't presented itself appropriately." Elias nodded, trying to look like someone who received questions from monarchs regularly and wasn't internally panicking. "What is beauty to your people?" Of all the questions he'd anticipated, diplomatic clarifications, cultural explanations, maybe inquiries about human mating rituals that everyone seemed fascinated by, this wasn't on the list. "Beauty, Your Majesty." "Yes, your species has diverse aesthetic preferences, I'm aware. But what do humans consider beautiful? I've studied human art, architecture, fashion. The variety is remarkable, but doesn't explain the underlying philosophy." Elias fell back on academic training, giving an answer that was technically correct and practically useless. He cited human art movements, cultural variations in beauty standards, the way different regions and time periods valued different aesthetic qualities. The Queen listened with the patience of someone waiting for a student to finish a wrong answer. "That's what your reference materials say," she observed when he finished. "What I'm asking is more specific. What is beauty to you, Dr. Worth? Not humanity in aggregate, you personally. What do you find beautiful?" The protocol guidelines had said nothing about personal philosophical questions from monarchs. Elias made a split-second decision that honesty might be less fatal than obvious diplomatic evasion. "My grandmother's hands," he said. "She did pottery for 60 years. Her hands were scarred from burns, calloused from work, joints swollen from arthritis. But she could create delicate pieces that museums wanted to display. The hands told the story of what they'd made." The Queen's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly, listening properly. "My sister's laugh," Elias continued, momentum carrying him past caution. "It's objectively too loud. She sounds like a startled seabird. But when she laughs, everyone around her starts laughing too, even if they don't know why. There's beauty in joy that's contagious." He was fully committed to honesty now, protocol abandoned. "The neighborhood dog when I was growing up. It lost a leg to illness. But every morning it would greet everyone with enthusiasm that bordered on violence. Beauty in resilience, in refusing to let damage define you." The room was quiet except for the faint hum of environmental systems. The Queen stood and walked to the window, looking out over her capital city, spires and flowing architecture, aesthetic harmony made manifest across kilometers of carefully planned beauty. "Do you find me beautiful, Dr. Worth?" Elias' brain, that magnificent organ responsible for keeping him alive and occasionally functional, decided this was an excellent moment to completely shut down. Every diplomatic training, every protocol guideline, every warning about cultural sensitivity vanished. He looked at her. Actually looked, without the careful distance he'd maintained during formal sessions. The scar along her jaw, faint but visible in the soft lighting. The way her left ear sat slightly lower than her right, a symmetry so minor that most would never notice but impossible to miss once you saw it. The calluses on her hands, visible now without the formal gloves she wore in public. The way she held herself, perfect posture that looked less like natural grace and more like something maintained through constant effort. "Yes," he said, "but probably not for the reasons you're expecting." She turned from the window to face him directly. "Explain. You're beautiful by Ithari standards, obviously. The genetic markers, the aesthetic proportions. But that's not what I see. I see someone who holds herself perfectly still when most people wouldn't notice imperfection. Someone who touched a scar during that session with the Thalian ambassador, trying to make sure it was still hidden. Someone whose hands show signs of weapons training that I'm guessing doesn't fit the image a queen is supposed to project." The Queen's expression was unreadable, something caught between several emotions that Elias couldn't parse. "You're beautiful because you carry weight that most people in that convocation hall don't understand. Because you're brilliant and ruthless when necessary and probably exhausted from being a symbol instead of a person. That's beauty to me. Not perfection, survival." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either applause or execution. Elias had approximately equal odds on which. "You're either remarkably honest or remarkably foolish," Queen Isaveth said finally. "Possibly both. I've been told that before, Your Majesty. I'm sure you have." She returned to her chair, her posture fractionally less rigid than before. "You're dismissed, Dr. Worth. I'll likely summon you again. Try not to cause any diplomatic incidents before then." Elias stood, bowed with what he hoped was appropriate depth, and fled with marginally more dignity than his escape from the cargo bay several careers ago had taught him was possible. Outside the study, he leaned against a wall and wondered if he just advanced human-Ithari relations or destroyed them completely. The Queen's expression had been impossible to read, her dismissal neither angry nor friendly. His datapad chimed with a message from Ambassador Pritchard. Debrief immediately. Elias looked at the message, at the closed door to the Queen's study, at the palace corridor stretching in both directions with its perfect aesthetic harmony. He was definitely going to need better coffee for this explanation. Ambassador Pritchard's office was designed for efficiency rather than comfort, which meant Elias sat in a chair that aggressively discouraged lingering, while Pritchard reviewed his report with the expression of someone reading a disaster forecast. "So let me make sure I understand," Pritchard said carefully. "The Queen of the HFY Sovereign Court, one of the most powerful political figures in this sector, asked you about beauty. And you told her about your grandmother's scarred hands and a three-legged dog. When you summarize it like that, it sounds worse than it was. How could it possibly sound worse? You gave philosophical commentary to a monarch whose entire culture is built on aesthetic perfection. She asked for my personal opinion. I gave it honestly." Pritchard set down the datapad with the careful control of someone resisting the urge to throw things. "Honesty is overrated in diplomacy, Dr. Worth, particularly when dealing with species who consider beauty a foundational cultural value." She didn't seem offended. "She didn't have you executed, which suggests either extreme tolerance or long-term planning. I'm not sure which concerns me more." Over the following week, Elias tried to return to his normal routine of professional invisibility. It lasted approximately 3 days before another summons arrived, this time inviting him to tour the royal archives with Queen Isaveth as his personal guide. The archives were exactly what Elias had imagined: vast halls of preserved texts, environmental controls maintaining optimal conditions, the accumulated knowledge of millennia organized with characteristic HFY precision. Queen Isaveth led him through sections on aesthetic philosophy, pulling texts that dated back centuries. "This is Kelver's treatise on harmony," she explained, showing him a volume bound in materials that looked organic but probably weren't. It established the foundational principles of HFY aesthetic theory. Beauty as mathematical proportion, visual elements arranged to create specific emotional responses, the idea that physical perfection reflects spiritual refinement. Elias listened, genuinely fascinated despite the undercurrent of confusion about why exactly the Queen was giving him a personal educational tour. "Your people don't follow these principles," she observed. It wasn't quite a question. "No, Your Majesty, human aesthetic preferences are chaotic. What one culture finds beautiful, another might find bizarre. We don't have unified theories, just thousands of individual opinions arguing with each other." That sounds exhausting. It absolutely is. They continued through the archives, the Queen presenting her culture's philosophy on beauty, while Elias provided human counterpoints that probably sounded like philosophical vandalism. But she kept asking questions, kept pushing him to explain why humans valued imperfection, why asymmetry didn't bother them, why they found beauty in things that were objectively flawed. During one discussion, surrounded by ancient texts on aesthetic perfection, Elias finally asked what he'd been wondering since the first summons. "Your Majesty, why are you asking me these things? You have scholars who have studied human culture extensively, philosophers who could provide more academic answers." The Queen was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on one of the ancient volumes. "Because scholars give me academic answers. I wanted to understand what someone actually believed, not what textbooks claim your species thinks. And you chose me specifically because during formal sessions you watch people. Not with calculation, not assessing political advantage. You watch like someone trying to understand. I found that curious." It was the most personal thing she'd said to him, and Elias had absolutely no idea how to respond. The Queen seemed to realize this, and smoothly redirected the conversation back to aesthetic philosophy. The archive tour became regular occurrences, followed by walks through palace gardens, where every plant was positioned for maximum visual harmony, every path designed to create specific emotional experiences through careful aesthetic manipulation. It was beautiful, objectively, mathematically, perfectly beautiful. It also felt sterile in ways Elias couldn't articulate without sounding insulting. During one garden walk, they rounded a corner and encountered a section that had been damaged by recent storms. The careful symmetry was broken, plants growing wild where they shouldn't, the designed harmony disrupted by weather that didn't care about aesthetic theory. Attendants moved to redirect them, to hide the imperfection until repairs could be completed. The Queen started to follow their guidance, then stopped. "Dr. Worth, would you prefer to see the damaged section?" Every diplomatic instinct told Elias to decline politely. Instead, he said, "Yes, actually, if that's permitted." They walked through the damaged garden, attendants following at a distance that suggested professional disapproval. Here, chaos had intruded on perfection. Plants grew in directions they weren't supposed to. Paths were blocked by fallen branches. The whole section looked like nature had staged a rebellion against careful design. "It will be repaired," the Queen said, more to herself than to him. "Restored to its original design. The damage will be erased." "That's a shame," Elias said before his brain could veto the statement. The Queen turned to look at him. "You find this preferable to intentional beauty. I find it interesting. Your original garden is beautiful, but it's static. This shows what happens when design meets reality. There's beauty in that too, in resilience, in things that survive damage." They stood in the damaged garden, surrounded by imperfection, while attendants waited at a diplomatic distance. The Queen's expression was complicated, layered with thoughts Elias couldn't read. "I was in an accident," she said suddenly. 20 years ago, shortly before I took the throne. An assassination attempt that partially succeeded, killed my predecessor, nearly killed me. Burns, broken bones, injuries that required extensive reconstruction." Elias said nothing, sensing that interrupting would shatter whatever moment this was. "The surgeons were remarkable. They rebuilt my face, my body, made me functional again, but not perfect. The scar on my jaw, you noticed it during the convocation session. The asymmetry in my ears. The way my left hand doesn't fully close anymore. All remnants of that accident." Her voice was carefully controlled, academic, like she was discussing someone else's medical history. "I've spent 20 years hiding these flaws. Cosmetics, careful positioning, gloves during public appearances. Because a queen must embody what our culture values. I must be the physical representation of aesthetic perfection. I've never felt beautiful since the accident. Only adequate at concealing damage." The damaged garden suddenly felt less like random destruction and more like deliberate metaphor. Elias chose his words carefully, aware that this conversation was significantly more important than anything in his diplomatic training. "On Earth, there's a Japanese art form called kintsugi. When pottery breaks, instead of hiding the cracks, they repair it with gold. The breaks become part of the object's beauty, part of its history. The idea is that surviving damage makes something more beautiful, not less." The Queen looked at him, her expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Your species finds broken things beautiful. We find survival beautiful. Resilience. The marks that show you've lived through something and kept going. Your scars don't make you less beautiful, Your Majesty. They make you real." "Real," she echoed, like the word was foreign. "My entire life has been about being a symbol, about embodying an ideal. I'm not sure I know how to be real." "I think you're more real than you realize. You asked me about beauty because you genuinely wanted to understand, not because it was politically useful. You brought me to a damaged garden instead of hiding it. That's real." The Queen started to respond, but movement in her peripheral vision made her turn sharply. Elias registered the motion half a second later. Something launched from a concealed position in the damaged foliage, trajectory aimed directly at the Queen. His body reacted before his brain finished processing. He pulled her down and sideways. heard something whistle past where her head had been, felt sudden spectacular pain blossom through his shoulder as the second projectile found a target. Arrow, some distant part of his brain supplied helpfully. You've been shot with an arrow. That's definitely not in your job description. Security swarmed from every direction, attendants forming protective barriers, weapons appearing in hands with practiced efficiency. Someone was shouting orders in Ithari that Elia's translator couldn't process fast enough. The queen was on the ground beside him, her hands pressed against his shoulder, trying to stop bleeding that his nervous system was becoming increasingly insistent about. That was profoundly foolish, she said, and Elias couldn't tell if she was angry or something else entirely. Seemed like a good idea at the time, he managed, speaking hurt. Most things hurt, actually. Pain was becoming a comprehensive experience. You could have been killed. So could you. That seemed worse. Security was dragging him toward the palace medical wing, and the queen was following, and Elias' last coherent thought before pain suppressants kicked in was that diplomatic incidents definitely shouldn't involve this much blood. Consciousness returned in stages, each more uncomfortable than the last. Elias woke in a medical facility that smelled like antiseptic and crushed expectations, his shoulder wrapped in enough bandages to qualify as clothing. Pain existed at a manageable distance, courtesy of Ithari medicine that was probably offended at having to treat something as primitive as arrow damage. Queen Isaveth sat beside his bed. She wasn't wearing the cosmetics that usually hid her scars. The line along her jaw was clearly visible in the soft medical wing lighting, the asymmetry of her ears apparent without careful positioning. She looked different, less symbol, more person, more real, like the word she'd been trying to understand in the garden. "You're awake," she said, not a question. "Apparently, how long was I out?" 16 hours. The surgeons rebuilt your shoulder. You'll have full function restored, though there will be scarring. Scars tell stories, Elias said, his mouth operating on pain-suppressant logic rather than diplomatic caution. That's what you taught me, in the garden. Before someone tried to kill you. Before you placed yourself between me and an assassin, yes. Her voice carried an edge that might have been anger or concern or something caught between them. That was foolish and instinctive and violated approximately 12 security protocols. Sorry. Next time I'll review protocols before reacting to assassination attempts. There won't be a next time. Security has been restructured. The faction responsible has been contained. She paused. They believed I was being too lenient with other species, too willing to compromise what they consider Ithari superiority. My private meetings with a human were cited as evidence of weakness. Well, that's flattering in the worst possible way. The queen's mouth twitched, amusement or exasperation, hard to tell. The surgeon mentioned that your injury will scar. That Ithari medicine can minimize it but not eliminate it completely. She seemed to expect you to be upset. Why would I be upset? Scars mean you survived something. That's better than the alternative. Most people want to avoid permanent marks. Most people haven't spent the last few weeks having philosophical discussions with a queen who taught them to see beauty differently. The queen was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with an intensity that made Elias suddenly aware that he probably looked terrible, unwashed, exhausted, hair doing whatever hair does when you've been unconscious for 16 hours. "You changed how I see things," she said finally. "How I see myself. I've spent 20 years hiding scars, treating them as flaws to be concealed. You made me question whether that was necessary, whether perfection was worth the effort of pretending. Your Majesty, Isaveth, when we're private you can use my name. I think you've earned that privilege by taking an arrow meant for me." Isaveth, Elias tried the name. "That's just instinct. Anyone would have." "No, not anyone. Most would have hesitated, assessed, calculated survival odds. You moved without thinking, which means the choice was already made somewhere deeper than conscious thought." She returned to her chair beside his bed. "You've shown me that beauty isn't just about appearance or aesthetic harmony. It's about character revealed under pressure, about choices that define who someone truly is. Elias tried to sit up, which his shoulder immediately protested. "You're giving me too much credit. I panicked and pulled someone out of the way. That's not philosophy, it's just not wanting to watch someone get shot." "And why didn't you want that?" The question hung in the air between them. Elias could feel his brain trying to formulate a diplomatic answer, something appropriate for the context. But the pain suppressants had apparently dissolved his filter along with his discomfort. "Because you're remarkable," he said. "Not because you're a queen or because you're powerful or because you're aesthetically perfect by Ithari standards. Because you asked genuine questions and listened to answers that contradicted everything your culture taught you. Because you brought me to a damaged garden and were vulnerable about things you'd hidden for 20 years. Because in 3 weeks, you taught me more about courage than I learned in 3 years of diplomatic training." Isavith's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to identify them all. "That's not an answer most people would give their queen. I think we established during our first conversation that I'm either remarkably honest or remarkably foolish." "Both," she said. "Definitely both. Which is apparently why I keep requesting your presence despite it being diplomatically inadvisable and politically complicated." Over the following days of his recovery, the Queen Isavith, though he still struggled to think of her that way, visited frequently. The conversations shifted from formal to personal, barriers dissolving in ways that probably violated several protocols neither of them mentioned. She told him about her childhood before the crown chose her path, about wanting to be a scholar, to study ancient texts without the weight of political responsibility, about the accident that killed her predecessor and left her broken in ways that went beyond physical damage. He told her about Earth, about his family who thought diplomatic service was glamorous and had no idea most of it involved paperwork and professional anxiety, about his grandmother who made pottery until her hands couldn't hold the tools anymore, about his sister whose loud laugh he missed during formal sessions where silence was golden. They traded vulnerabilities like currency, small pieces of themselves that built toward something neither had planned for. On his last day in the medical wing, Isavith arrived without attendance. The absence felt significant, no witnesses, no official capacity, just 2 people in a room with soft lighting and honest words. "I've decided to stop hiding my scars in public settings," she said without preamble. "Not all at once, that would be too dramatic even for me, but gradually, starting with the formal Unity Accord session next week. That's brave. It's terrifying. But you've taught me that terror might be worth experiencing if the alternative is hiding forever." She paused, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap, a nervous gesture he'd never seen her make before. "I've also drafted a position for you. Cultural advisor to the Queen, not just to the human delegation. It's unprecedented, will cause political complications, and is probably dangerous given recent events." Elias' brain, still operating on reduced capacity and pain suppressants, took a moment to process this. "You want me to stay, officially. I want your perspective, your honesty, your ability to see things my court has forgotten how to see." She met his eyes. "I want you close enough that we can continue having conversations that change how I understand the world, if you're willing." Every diplomatic instinct told Elias to consider carefully, to weigh implications, to consult with Ambassador Pritchard and probably several dozen advisors. Instead, he said, "Yes," without thinking about it. "I've learned that my best decisions happen when I don't overthink them, usually right before I do something that looks foolish in retrospect." Isavith smiled, genuine and unguarded, the expression that transformed her face from symbol to person. "Then we're agreed. You'll be foolish in an official capacity. I'm sure the court will be delighted." "Probably not, but I've stopped worrying about delighting people who already want me gone. That's remarkably healthy for a diplomat." "I'm a terrible diplomat. That's probably why this works." Medical staff cleared him for light duty the next day. His shoulder protested most movements with reminders that arrows were not recommended recreational activities. The scar, when they finally removed the bandages, was impressive, a line across his shoulder that would fade but never fully disappear. Elias looked at it in the mirror and thought about kintsugi, about breaks repaired with gold, damage that became part of beauty rather than something to hide. He thought about Isavith, preparing to show her own scars to a court that valued perfection, about the courage that required, the weight of changing not just herself but the cultural expectations of an entire civilization. Ambassador Pritchard was predictably supportive when Elias informed him of the position change. "You've been here 3 years and somehow managed to become personally employed by the most powerful political figure in the sector. I'm not sure whether to congratulate you or file a report expressing concern for your judgment. Both feels appropriate. Probably. Try not to cause any interstellar incidents, or if you do, at least make them interesting enough that the reports are entertaining." The week passed in a blur of paperwork, because even unprecedented political appointments required forms in triplicate and briefings about his new role. Cultural advisor to the Queen meant access to private councils, attendance at restricted sessions, and enough security clearance to make his previous position look like an internship. It also meant proximity to Isavith that went beyond the occasional private audience. Shared meals where they discussed everything from aesthetic philosophy to terrible human television shows she discovered and found fascinating. Walks through gardens, now including the damaged section, which she'd ordered preserved rather than repaired. Moments that felt less like professional consultations and more like something neither of them had words for yet. The formal Unity Accord session arrived with all the pageantry his first weeks had taught him to expect. Delegates in their hierarchical circles, lighting carefully arranged, every detail designed for maximum aesthetic and political impact. Elias sat in a different section now, close to the center, near enough to the royal dais that other delegates kept glancing at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Queen Isavith entered with her usual composed grace, attendants following at precisely measured distances. But when she took her position at the dais, when light caught her face at those carefully calculated angles, the scar along her jaw was clearly visible. No cosmetics hiding it, no careful positioning to minimize its appearance, just a mark that told a story of survival, visible to everyone in the hall. The reaction was immediate, murmurs that the acoustics carried across the space, delegates leaning toward each other in hushed conversations, the kind of attention that preceded either disaster or revolution. Isavith waited for silence with the patience of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. When she spoke, her voice carried the same authority it always had, but something in the delivery had changed. Less symbol, more person. "Before we begin formal proceedings, I want to address a philosophical question that's been raised regarding Ithari aesthetic values and their place in interspecies cooperation." She spoke about beauty as her culture understood it, mathematical harmony, visual perfection, the accumulated wisdom of millennia. Then she spoke about what she'd learned from other perspectives, from conversations that challenged assumptions she'd held without questioning. "Beauty, I've come to understand, is not merely what we see but what we choose to value. Perfection has its place, but so does resilience. Aesthetic harmony matters, but so does the courage to survive damage and continue forward. I stand before you today not as a perfect symbol of Ithari values, but as someone who has learned that marks of survival are worth displaying rather than hiding." Some delegates looked scandalized, others appeared thoughtful. A few seemed genuinely moved, though Elias suspected those were the ones who'd carried their own hidden scars and recognized the courage this required. Throughout the speech, Isavith's gaze occasionally found his across the hall. Not obviously, she was too skilled for that, but in small moments that acknowledged what his honesty had begun and what her courage had chosen to continue. The session proceeded with its usual diplomatic complexity, disputes resolved through careful language and political maneuvering. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a change too subtle to quantify but impossible to miss if you knew what to look for. After the formal proceedings, Elias found Isaveth in her private study, surrounded by books and soft lighting that made everything feel less official. "How bad is the political fallout?" he asked. "3 traditional factions have filed formal protests. 2 others have expressed private support. The remainder are waiting to see which way momentum shifts before committing." She smiled, small and genuine. "About what I expected. Change never comes without resistance. Was it worth it? Ask me in a year when we see whether this destroys my political capital or transforms it." She paused. "Actually, yes. It was worth it regardless of political outcome. Because for the first time in 20 years, I stood before my court as myself rather than a carefully maintained symbol. That has value beyond politics." Elias moved closer, his shoulder protesting the movement but manageable now. "For what it's worth, I thought you were extraordinary, both before and after you decided to stop hiding, but especially after. Because visible scars are beautiful. Because courage is beautiful. And choosing to be seen as you actually are, knowing it might cost you everything, takes remarkable courage." Isaveth looked at him with an expression that made his pulse forget its rhythm, something caught between hope and fear and possibility. "I find myself curious about human relationship customs. Specifically how your people navigate attraction across professional boundaries. Poorly, usually, with lots of awkward conversations and questionable decisions. That sounds terrible. It absolutely is. But sometimes the terrible, awkward conversations lead to something worthwhile. Is this one of those times?" Elias considered lying, considered diplomatic evasion, considered every cautious instinct that had kept him safe for 3 years. Then he thought about kintsugi and damaged gardens and the courage it took to be real. "I think it might be, if you're willing to find out." Isaveth's smile was the genuine one, the expression that transformed her from queen to person to something specific and wonderful and terrifying. "I think I am, though we should probably expect it to be complicated. Everything worthwhile is complicated. That's remarkably optimistic for someone who was shot 3 weeks ago. I'm choosing to interpret that as character development rather than poor judgment." She laughed, genuinely laughed, the sound filling the study in ways that perfect aesthetic harmony never could. And in that moment, surrounded by ancient books and soft lighting, and the accumulated weight of cultural expectations they were both choosing to challenge, Elias understood something fundamental about beauty. It wasn't just about being seen. It was about being truly looked at by someone willing to see past surfaces, past symbols, past the carefully maintained presentations everyone wore like armor. It was about looking back and recognizing the same courage in them, the willingness to be real, to show scars, to choose vulnerability despite every instinct toward self-protection. It was, he realized, about choosing to try. Together. Knowing it might be complicated and awkward and politically inadvisable, but absolutely worth it. The assassination attempt had consequences that rippled through ethari political structures like cracks through flawed crystal. Security was restructured entirely. New protocols, new personnel, new systems that made Elias' previous life of relative invisibility impossible to maintain. His new position as cultural advisor meant constant proximity to Isaveth, which meant constant surveillance, which meant his every movement was analyzed by people whose job was professional paranoia. Ambassador Pritchard called it living in a fishbowl made of anxiety. Elias called it my new normal. Isaveth called it necessary inconvenience, and proceeded to ignore it with the practiced ease of someone who'd lived under observation for 20 years. The investigation into the assassination attempt revealed a conspiracy more extensive than initial reports suggested. Not just a handful of extremists, but a coordinated faction within the court who believed Isaveth's openness to other species represented weakness. Her decision to stop hiding her scars, publicly displaying what they considered imperfection, had been the final provocation. 12 arrests, 4 exile sentences, political fallout that restructured several advisory positions and triggered early elections in 2 regional councils. Through it all, Isaveth maintained the composure that had made her an effective queen for 2 decades. But Elias saw what others missed: the weight she carried in private moments, the exhaustion that accumulated when every decision had to account for factions actively working against her. They developed routines that existed in the spaces between official duties. Morning meetings in her study where they discussed everything from diplomatic strategy to terrible human media she'd become fascinated by. Walks through the gardens, including the damaged section she'd refused to repair, which had become something of a political statement in itself. Late evening conversations when the palace settled into quiet and they could be people rather than positions. It was during one of these evening conversations, 3 months after the assassination attempt, that Isaveth asked a question that Elias had been simultaneously expecting and dreading. What do humans do when they're attracted to someone, but circumstances make pursuit complicated? They were in the observation room adjacent to her study, windows showing the capital city lit against darkness, perfect spires and aesthetic harmony that looked almost organic from this distance. Elias considered several diplomatic answers before settling on honesty. We agonize about it, overthink every interaction, convince ourselves it's inappropriate or impossible or too complicated to risk. Then eventually either do something about it or regret not doing something about it. That sounds exhausting. It absolutely is. Which stage are you currently experiencing? Isaveth turned from the window to face him directly. The one where I've spent 3 months trying to convince myself that attraction to my cultural advisor is inappropriate, politically inadvisable, and complicated by power dynamics that make genuine consent questionable. And how's that working out? Poorly. I keep having thoughts that involve ignoring my own very logical arguments. Elias' brain, that magnificent organ responsible for survival and occasionally poor decisions, decided this was the moment for complete honesty. For what it's worth, I've been experiencing the same internal debate, except my version involves being terrified that expressing interest might make you uncomfortable, violate professional boundaries, or get me exiled by whatever security protocols govern relationships between queens and their advisors. There are no protocols for this. I checked. Apparently previous cultural advisors were either not interesting enough or more sensible about maintaining professional distance. We could maintain professional distance. Keep everything formal and appropriate. Pretend the attraction doesn't exist and hope it goes away through sheer force of will and avoidance. We could, Isaveth agreed. Would you prefer that? No. But I'd prefer it over making you uncomfortable or putting you in a position where you feel pressured by power dynamics. Then let me be clear about something. She moved closer, close enough that Elias could see the scar along her jaw in detail, the way it caught light like the kintsugi repairs they discussed months ago. I'm not uncomfortable. I'm not feeling pressured. What I'm feeling is frustrated that my position makes it difficult to express interest without worrying about how it might be perceived. You've been careful to never overstep, which I appreciate, but it also means we're both dancing around something obvious while pretending we're not. So what do we do about it? I have no idea. Ithari courtship protocols are formal affairs with clearly defined stages and cultural expectations, none of which account for a queen being interested in a human who fundamentally challenged her worldview by talking about pottery and 3-legged dogs. Elias laughed despite the tension. We could skip the formal protocols, try the human approach of being awkward and honest and seeing what happens. That sounds terrifying. It absolutely is. But you told me once that terror might be worth experiencing if the alternative is hiding forever. Isaveth's expression shifted, something vulnerable showing through the careful control she usually maintained. I did say that. Before you took an arrow meant for me and completely destroyed my ability to maintain professional distance. To be fair, the arrow taking wasn't a strategic relationship move. That was just instinct. I know. That's what made it significant. You acted without calculation, which meant the choice came from somewhere genuine. She reached out slowly, giving him time to move away if he wanted, and her hand settled against his face with careful precision. I want to try, whatever this is, however complicated it becomes, but only if you're certain it's what you want. Not because I'm a queen and refusing might be awkward, because you genuinely want to navigate this disaster with me. Elias leaned into the touch, his own hand rising to cover hers. I want to try. I've wanted to try since you brought me to a damaged garden and were vulnerable about things you'd hidden for 20 years. I just didn't know if it was permitted to want that. It's permitted. Inadvisable, politically complicated, and probably going to cause diplomatic incidents we can't even imagine yet, but permitted. They stood in the observation room while the city lights flickered below. Two people who'd found each other through philosophical discussions and assassination attempts, and the courage to be real. When Isavith kissed him, it was careful and uncertain, and nothing like the perfect aesthetic harmony her culture valued. It was better. It was real. The political implications of their relationship became apparent over the following weeks. Traditional factions, who'd already opposed Isavith's policy changes, now had additional ammunition. A queen involved with a human advisor, crossing species lines in ways that some considered inappropriate. Conservative councils filed formal protests. 3 minor political groups called for her abdication on grounds of conduct unbecoming the throne. Isavith handled it the way she handled everything, with composed efficiency and careful strategy that made opposition look reactionary rather than principled. But Elias watched the toll it took, the way each protest and formal complaint added to the weight she carried. We could keep this private, he suggested during one particularly difficult week where 4 separate councils had filed complaints. Not hide it exactly, but not make it publicly visible. Reduce the political ammunition. Isavith looked at him from across her study, surrounded by the books and documents that marked her daily work. And how long would that last? My court notices everything. Privacy is an illusion when you're constantly observed. Then what do we do? What we've been doing. Be honest about what we are. Let them file their protests and formal complaints. Eventually, they'll realize that attempting to control my personal life is both futile and politically exhausting. You make it sound simple. It's not simple at all. But hiding didn't serve me well for 20 years. I'm not returning to that approach now. The Unity Accord session 6 months after Isavith's speech about beauty and scars became a turning point. Not because of any dramatic political maneuvering, but because of a small moment most delegates probably didn't notice. During a recess, Isavith stood from the dais and crossed to where Elias sat in his advisor section. In full view of assembled delegates, she touched his hand briefly, a gesture of connection that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but communicated volumes. The traditionalists were scandalized. Progressive factions saw it as a statement about personal autonomy. Most delegates filed it away as interesting political data that might be useful later. But what mattered to Elias was the choice itself. Isavith deciding that being seen, being real, being openly connected to someone who mattered to her was worth whatever political cost it carried. That evening, back in the privacy of her study, she showed him a proposal that had been drafted by a coalition of younger Ithari politicians. A reform to courtship laws that would formally recognize interspecies partnerships, granting them the same legal standing as traditional Ithari bonds. They're using us as the test case, Isavith explained. If a queen can openly partner with someone from another species, it sets precedent for others. They think it might pass with enough political momentum. How do you feel about being a test case? Terrified, hopeful, exhausted from having my personal life become political theater. She set down the proposal and looked at him directly, but also certain that this is worthwhile, that whatever complications arise, choosing you was the right decision. Elias moved around the desk to stand beside her chair, his shoulder still twinged occasionally, a reminder of arrows and gardens and the moment everything changed. I never imagined 3 years ago that I'd end up here, personally employed by a queen, involved in changing laws about interspecies relationships, generally living a life that sounds fictional when I explain it to people back home. Regrets? None. Terror, yes. Constant low-grade anxiety about diplomatic incidents, definitely, but no regrets. Isavith stood close enough that he could see every detail of the scar she no longer hid, the line that told a story of survival, of choosing to continue after damage that could have ended her. "You changed my life," she said quietly. "Not just politically or philosophically. You changed how I see myself, made me believe that marks of survival could be beautiful instead of shameful. I don't have adequate words for what that means. You changed mine too, made me believe that honesty might be more valuable than diplomatic caution, that being real, even when it's terrifying, is worth the risk." They stood in the study surrounded by books and soft lighting, two people from different worlds who'd found each other through questions about beauty and answered with vulnerability. Outside, the capital city maintained its perfect aesthetic harmony, spires and flowing architecture, the accumulated artistic achievement of millennia. But inside, in this room, beauty looked different. It looked like scars displayed openly, like hands that touched despite political implications, like two people choosing connection over safety, honesty over careful presentation. It looked like courage. The reform passed 8 months later, narrowly but decisively. Interspecies partnerships were granted full legal recognition, with provisions for cultural differences and ceremonies that honored both traditions involved. Isavith and Elias became, somewhat reluctantly, the public face of this change. Their relationship analyzed, celebrated, and criticized, depending on which political faction was commenting. Through it all, they maintained what they'd built in private: conversations that challenged assumptions, walks through gardens that included damaged sections, moments of genuine connection that existed regardless of political implications. On the anniversary of their first conversation about beauty, Elias found Isavith in the observation room, watching city lights flicker against darkness. "Thinking about anything specific?" he asked. About how a simple question changed everything. How asking a human about beauty led to reformation of courtship laws and challenges to aesthetic philosophy I'd accepted without question for 40 years. Regrets? She turned to face him, her scar visible in the dim lighting, her expression carrying none of the careful control she maintained in public. "None. Only gratitude that I was brave enough to ask, that you were honest enough to answer, that we were both foolish enough to pursue something that everyone assured us was complicated and inadvisable. It is complicated and inadvisable. Absolutely. But also worthwhile. Beauty isn't just about being seen, Elias. It's about being truly looked at by someone willing to see past surfaces. Someone who looks at scars and sees stories worth telling. Someone who makes you believe that survival is something to display rather than hide." She took his hand, fingers interlacing with practiced ease. "You taught me that, and I'm grateful every day that you were either brave enough or foolish enough to be honest when I asked." "Both," Elias said, echoing their first conversation. "Definitely both." They stood together watching the city, two people who'd bridged the space between different worlds not through diplomatic maneuvering or political strategy, but through simple honesty about what they found beautiful. Sometimes, they'd learned, the most profound changes don't come from grand gestures or calculated plans. They come from asking genuine questions and being brave enough to listen to answers that challenge everything you thought you knew. They come from choosing to be real, to show scars, to connect despite complications. They come from understanding that beauty, true beauty, is something felt by those who truly look. And sometimes, if you're fortunate and brave and willing to be foolish, it's something you find looking back.